Hello and welcome to another instalment of History Hack. Alina, who have we got with us today?
We've got Peter Reavill, who is an archaeologist specialising in the Bronze Age, and he also works for the British Museum's Portable Antiquity Scheme. And today he's going to tell us what this is. So welcome, Peter.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me on.
This is brilliant. Like, you are essentially the treasure police. Like, Nicolas Cage needs to watch his back. So what is the Treasure Act of 1996 and why is it relevant to what we're going to be talking about today?
Well, the Treasure Act applies just to England and Wales, and I get to deal with it a lot because people who go out metal detecting, people who dig things up in their gardens, it's the one piece of legislation in the UK that you need to be aware of. And so I get lots of emails saying, I found this really cool thing in my garden. What is it? Or I've been out metal detecting and here's some stuff. And it's part of my role to go through that. And if I see something which is treasure or potential treasure, I need to tell them that so they can obey the law.
2015, something happened that you got really, really involved with, which basically talks about the Treasure Act, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. As in, I work really closely with the metal detecting community in my patch, and I cover Shropshire and Herefordshire, which sits next to Wales in England. So I've got a sort of a borderland, and I work really closely with the metal detectorist in my part of the world. So I get to hear when something interesting has been found because rumours go round faster than anything else. So I get to hear about stuff on the grapevine, and back in 2015. Part of that was that I'd heard that two chaps had come up from South Wales and found something really exciting outside Leinster, which is a market town in Herefordshire. And I didn't think too much of it because, as I say, I hear lots of rumours, but it was the same story from lots of different people. And they said, oh, you need to go on the web, you need to go onto this forum because you can see some pictures of it. And by the time I got there, I could see nothing. And that's not unusual because I'm an archaeologist. So, I started to put some feelers out and to find out what was going on. And in the meantime, one of my colleagues down in South Wales, Mark, who works at the National Museum and Galleries in Wales, had two metal detectors bring in a selection of finds which they found near Leinster. We're like, problem solved. That's okay. That's what they found. And there were some really interesting objects. There was a massive silver armlet, so something which should go around the top of your arm, around your bicep, with a beast biting itself. There was a massive gold ring, a real sort of knuckle duster of a gold ring. And there are also a couple of silver coins. And those silver coins were really, really rare, as in stupidly rare, as in they're only sort of 20 or 30 of these sort of have been found in the last sort of 40 years. And at that point, Mark did his treasure talk and was like, yes, these gold objects are treasure, and there are these two silver coins. They'll also, because they were roughly the same date, they were from around about the sort of 7th, 8th century AD. And he said, okay, this looks like a hoard. And they were like, oh no, these two coins were found way apart from one another. They couldn't be found together. And that sort of set the alarm bells ringing, and the fact that I'd heard the rumours as well. And it all then went a bit quiet until a cache of coins was reported from a major coin dealer in London. And within those were similar coins in a similar condition. And slowly we had the feeling that there was this massive hoard had been discovered. And as in we weren't as archaeologists seeing it.
Ouch. So let's go back a bit. Metal
Sure.
detecting. We all know what it is. This is people with metal detectors who go out for fun and go looking for stuff. But where do they go? And you mentioned like a whole community. So are there hotspots for it? And what if they're not allowed to keep treasure? Is it just a hobby thing? Do they just want the kudos of going to find it? What kind of motivates people to do this as a hobby?
So there's lots of reasons people go out metal detecting, and some of it's to do with mental health, some of it's to do with sort of as in being outside in the countryside, and sort of like golf is a good walk ruined. Well, metal detecting also gets you outside and out and about. And in the way it happens, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Our take on it, though, is that these metal detectors go ping and they dig up a find, and that find could be something which was lost 10 years ago, but it could be something which was lost 1,000 years or 2,000 years ago. And all of that information is what the Portable Antiquity Scheme is about. So we basically record objects, whether they're treasure or not, as long as they have an archaeological interest to them. And the reason for that is that our sort of country, our landscape is made up of a patchwork of sites, but it's not just limited to the sites we know about. There are undiscovered sites, there are undiscovered settlements and things like that. But there's also the stuff which happens between the gaps, as in all the stuff which falls in the gaps, which has this sort of potential of telling us something really, really exciting about our history, about sort of the archaeology of the British Isles. And so the scheme was set up to record all of this and extra information. And part of that is that we deal with treasure, but for every year I see maybe 20 or 30 treasure cases from my patch. I know there are at least sort of 2,000 or 3,000 objects found, and they might not be treasure. So part of my role is treasure, but part of it isn't. And the whole purpose of this is that it's a relationship. So the detectorist has to be comfortable with coming into a museum and saying, here's some stuff I found. And likewise, I need to be comfortable with them coming in and saying, well, yeah, here's this stuff. I'll tell you a little bit about it. I'll make a record of it, and then we'll all be richer for it. And that works really well. Over the last 20 years, the schemes, a national scheme, has recorded 1.5 million artefacts found by the public, which is a stupidly large amount of stuff, which basically is people's rubbish that's been thrown away and that we're now looking through.
I really like that, because in Poland, metal detecting is actually illegal. So if you're ever found with a metal detector, I'm not quite sure of the law how it works exactly, but I think you can go to prison for it.
Is that to do with the danger of what you could be digging up in Poland, though?
Do you know what it actually really is to do? It's to do with Nazi memorabilia. Because obviously you're going to find lots of, because I know we're going completely off topic here, but if you're finding things like, I don't know, buttons with a swastika on it or something, for example, and that kind of bartering is actually illegal in this country. And I understand why it is, but you have to get special permission, you have to be an archaeologist, you have to, this is long process to even be able to be out with your metal detector. And even if you're out there, the police are still going to stop you and ask you for documents and all sorts of things.
Yeah, and that's the case across most of Europe. So England and Wales have a very interesting sort of way they look at the law. And there was, back in the 1980s, there was a huge campaign to try and stop metal detecting or to license it or to control it. And the UK went down one way of trying to deal with this, and PAS is part of our solution to that, which is basically, as long as you have the permission of the landowner to be where you are, and you're not on a scheduled monument, so a protected site, then you can basically go metal detecting. And there are very, very few things. So everything we record is voluntary, apart from the treasure, which is sort of legally something you have to do. So it's up to the metal detectorist and it's up to the landowner whether they report those finds. And that really messes with the heads with lots of archaeologists. And across Europe, it's seen as being quite an unusual and odd thing. But then Britain in Europe is the odd one out in so many different ways. We won't even go there.
How many times, I'm just curious, do people end up in jail here then?
So it happens, and it happens now more frequently than not. So every year there are a handful of sort of criminal trials where people have either deliberately not reported an object that they had to, or they've been sort of convicted of theft, which is basically they've been on the land without the permission of the landowner and stolen the objects. But that is really, really rare. I think we try and take the approach of, and this is part of the Treasure Act, is that you might find an object of treasure and you have a legal obligation to report that. But if a local museum wants to acquire it, wants to sort of own it, then they pay the market value for it, and that market value is split between the finder and the landowner. And so that's why you have sort of cases like the Staffordshire Hoard, where two museums in Stoke and Birmingham acquired it, and the sort of finder and the landowner got significant amounts of money for these objects. So in a way, the system is set up in a way that rewards good practice and rewards finders for doing the right thing. And that payment is completely tax-free. It's a gift from the Crown, because under our law, all items of treasure belong to the Crown, belong to the Queen.
Did the guys in 2015, did they get arrested?
So yeah, as in, basically, we started, as in, sort of, we informed the police that we felt that there was a much larger group of material than had been reported. And the police started a police investigation of that, as they would of any crime. And as their investigation unfolded, they did lots of things. So they investigated, they looked through the phone records and computer records of the people that were arrested. They searched their houses and their properties and their vehicles. English Heritage, or Historic England, which is sort of the national sort of heritage agency in England and Wales, or in England, funded a massive excavation project or landscape project outside Leominster to try and understand where these finds were from in the ground, and to understand sort of why they were there. So although this story is all about sort of these metal detectorists were arrested and were later imprisoned, and the stuff they found is worth millions of pounds, as in individual coins were worth £10,000 to £15,000 a piece. So there's this huge sort of story there about theft, but there's also a huge sort of archaeological question of why is this stuff where it was found?
I really want to know, so where this stuff was found, what's significant about where they found the hoard?
So if you walked to this field, it looks like almost every other field in Herefordshire. It's wet. Well, when I was there, it was wet and soggy, and ploughed for crops. The interesting thing is Leominster itself. So Leominster is has a very early foundation as a town. It's sort of set up by a branch of the Mercian kings in the 6th and 7th century, and was the principal town of Herefordshire for maybe sort of 300 or 400 years. So it has a monastery, it has a very sort of strong market, and it's only when sort of in the later Saxon period and in the Norman period that focus shifts down to Hereford. So we've got a royal centre and a religious centre, so a place of power. And looking at the landscape, so there are a number of sort of sunken ways, so sort of medieval or, well, potentially much earlier routes from this, and that this find spot sits very close to a spring, very close to one of these routeways out of the town. And so it would be a fairly straightforward place to put it. I keep mentioning sort of words like Saxon and Norman. So this hoard is a hoard of either Viking objects or objects which the Vikings have acquired. And at this point, we are looking at a country in flux, a country of kingdoms, and it's at a point where a great army of Vikings comes down from the north and from the east and raids Alfred's Wessex, and then basically overwinters in a number of places. And that's very well understood in sort of eastern Britain, but in western Britain, we have very, very little evidence for this sort of activity. And this hoard is one of the very first pieces of evidence for the march for the borderlands of this sort of activity being there at all.
So do we know actually why they left these hoards?
So there's lots of different reasons. One of them is as in most of these hoards, which are worth a lot of money sort of contemporary at the time are basically somebody putting it somewhere safe and hoping to come back and collect it. And that's probably what this hoard is. It's probably a packet, a parcel of gold and silver, deliberately hidden with the intention of coming back and using it, taking it away, benefiting from it. The one slight curveball here is that it's found very close to a spring head, and so that always says, well, is there a ritual thing there? Is it a gift to the gods? Is it a tithe? Is it a thing of goodwill, as in we've been out, we've gathered all this material together? Is this a sort of percentage to give back to make sure that we have continued good luck? So the problem with all of these discoveries, no matter what they are, is that there's probably about 6 reasons for them to be in the ground, and we as archaeologists can only guess at what those are. And anybody who tells you different is probably not telling the truth.
Speaking of not telling the truth, how many finds were made last year, do you think, and how many were declared?
That's a really good question. It's something which is really hard to get around. Last year was a difficult year because of the pandemic, and sort of metal detecting has been severely curtailed because of sort of the global emergency, the sort of healthcare crisis. So at the moment, as I'm speaking to you now, metal detecting in England is not allowed. It's you can't go about it.
Does it not count as exercise?
Some people would like it to,
yeah.
But at the moment it isn't on the list of permitted things to do as exercise.
Okay.
Although
is there a list? I didn't know that.
There's a list, and it depends on who you speak to as what goes on the list. But apparently you can go fishing now, because that's exercise.
Sitting on your arse staring at the water.
Exactly, getting
Not
cold.
walking up and down with a metal detector is not. It just says it all, doesn't it?
Yeah. So, as in, I think.
So technically, nobody should be metal detecting.
So at the moment, technically, unless you're an archaeologist on a construction site, because as in archaeologists use metal detectors as well.
Yeah, and I guess the construction site is the only way you could essentially be archaeology-ing at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah,
Alex,
so
you've got to change your job status now. Go and be an archaeologist and get yourself on a building site.
I know, because it's essential to the nation.
Is it?
No, but you could find some interesting shit.
I could, because I've got so many free hours in the day.
No, you don't.
I was going to say. So, really, then nothing was. Well, I guess they could have been out in the summer declaring, couldn't they?
So, yeah, as in at points during last year, at different stages, metal detecting was allowed. And last year, there were over 1,000 treasure cases from England and Wales. Usually, the year before, there was about 1,200. So, as in, people were out and finding stuff. But our figures for last year suggest that sort of fewer things were offered for recording. In a normal year, I always think we probably see the majority of the important finds, which would be important to the story of a county or a place. But we probably only see a percentage of the other in-hand finds. As in, because of the way the law works here, a finder isn't obligated to report their finds if they're not treasure. So it's always an individual decision, and it's often a decision by the landowner and the finder as well. So the landowner whose land they're on might say, I don't want anybody to know what you're finding on my ground, and the detectorist will say, fair enough. Now the problem is that there are hundreds of finds that will then sit in somebody's display cabinet, and the sort of the information about where they're from could well be lost. And what you end up then is with just stuff, just things, old things which could be quite important for a place's story, not being sort of recognised or understood or being put into context. And that's one of the real tragedies of our system, is that we lose a huge amount from it. And that's really hard being an archaeologist, because in an ideal world, we're like sort of, what's the character who's got to catch them all?
Indiana Jones.
No, the
Damn.
computer game.
Lara Croft.
No, you've got to catch them all is the catchphrase.
Pokemon.
Pokemon. So archaeologists, basically Pokemon. We want to catch them all. We want to get all of the information.
Okay.
But we're also there where we know that we won't get all of that information. So it's all about sort of trying to find a balance, trying to be pragmatic over sort of the amazing things which are found and balance that against the sort of things that we might lose out on. So, for example, you mentioned Poland. How many people are metal detecting in Poland without a license and with, as in being completely illegal? And if it's completely illegal, how do the museums ever see the stuff which they find? As in, it must be, as in it must happen everywhere, but it's just how you capture that information.
Yeah, because somebody could go into the middle of a forest or the middle of a field where nobody can see them. There's no, parking or roads or anything, and they're out in the middle of this field, just metal detecting. Nobody's going to bother them. Find something, stick a flag in it, dig it up, take it home.
And that's part of the problem, isn't it? Is where does the line get drawn? Where does sort of the archaeology suffer so badly from it that you have to do something? And if that community is sort of ostracized, how do you then sort of bring them back on board to get the information out of them? As in, what do you lose?
I've got to ask, just because this is me. So when you catch people and they're in trouble and that, how much opposition do they put up? Do they just go, "Oh, it's a fair cop, I didn't declare, I'm in trouble," or do you end up dealing with some mad people?
Well, the thing with the Treasure Act is there's this clause in it which basically says if you don't realise what you found, and then somebody says, "Wow, that's really important. You need to make a record, or you need to report that as potential treasure," then as long as they do that within 14 days, they won't sort of face prosecution over it. So you might have, and this happens a lot, not necessarily because they're trying to pull the wool over my eyes. It's just because I'll see a broken object, and I'm like, that's a bit off of one of those. And it's only when they understand the whole object, they go, "Oh yeah, of course that's that. I've had that in the bottom of my case for 15 years and never known what it was." So there is that element to it. Whereas you've also got the blatant stuff, which is where this case from Leinster is. Though you've got guys who know what they found, they've deliberately concealed sort of the finding of it, and then they've gone on to the black market. They've gone through sort of back channels, as it were, to try and shift the majority of the stuff. And that's the real tragedy of this hoard, is that we have probably about 10% of it, or the police were able to recover 10% of the find, which means there's 90% still out there waiting to be covered, whether it's within a collector's stash, whether it's in private hands. We just don't know. And the police have said they're going to keep a sort of an open file on it and hope that one day more information will come forward.
So this is a completely stupid question from me, but how much of an access do you have to this black market? I mean, do you hear things on the grapevine? Do you have like maybe spies somewhere in there? Me with this extravagant kind of thing in my mind going, "Oh my God, it's like this whole spy network of
like the dark net."
Yeah, totally.
So basically, we can only act on the information we're given, and we're not police officers, so we can't arrest people, we can't compel them to do anything. And it's through the goodwill of the metal detecting community. So basically, those people who go out metal detecting and follow the rules, which are the vast majority, and are as appalled, if not more appalled, by people who sort of break the law, they're the ones who come forward and tell us this information. It isn't about sort of us being there as sort of archaeological spies. It's about sort of us working in sort of direct contact with this community and saying, "Look, if you tell us about stuff, we'll take action, but we can't do anything without that information." And it's through those sort of that goodwill, those sort of areas of cooperation and trust, is how we get to know about these things. So if these guys from Leinster hadn't been on the web and hadn't told their mates, "Look at this really cool stuff we found," we wouldn't have known any different. And in fact, if you said, would you put a pin on a map in Herefordshire where a Viking hoard would be found, it wouldn't be there, as in it wouldn't, in the first 10 pinpricks, it wouldn't be there. And the reason is that, as we said before, as in, if you're in the middle of nowhere and you find something, and if you don't tell anyone, how do you know it was found?
People get into this solely to make money.
I think some do. I think some do, and if you type Roman coin or Roman brooch or medieval coin into eBay or Etsy or one of the sort of the auction websites, you will come up with a huge number of objects for sale, quite legally, probably in most cases. So there are people there who supplement their income from metal detecting, but equally, I'd say sort of a good sort of 8 out of 10 people that I meet, they're in it for the hobby. They're in it for the sort of the information, the sort of the landscape history of where they live. So the vast majority of people who go metal detecting that I deal with tend to metal detect in around the places they live or work. And because of that, we have a huge sort of knowledge about sort of the early history of some of the villages in our part of the world. And it isn't through sort of the history of the places, it's physically in the objects that people pull out of the ground. And that is sort of, you can understand why somebody would want to do that. Personally, for me, I think with the amount of stuff that I see being found and the amount of sort of, if you think if you empty the contents of your house into a field and leave it for 100 years, the only stuff you're going to pick out is the stuff which doesn't burn and won't rot away. So you think of the hundreds of thousands of bits of metal which have no interest to them whatsoever. These guys are finding those, but they're also finding sort of a few objects which are much, much older. So I think it's sort of, it takes a certain mindset and a certain sort of interest in the past to do it. And it is very hands-on, as in, I understand the appeal completely. Although I have lots of other sort of hobbies that I can go and do, which means I stay warm and dry inside, which is what I prefer.
I have to ask, so we've talked a lot about the naughty people, but where do the finds go, the good finds, when people are nice and they come and tell you? And
so we, over the last sort of 15, 20 years or so, the museums that we all work alongside are much richer in the number of objects. So those are objects which have either been purchased through the Treasure Act, acquired through the Treasure Act. They might be gifts. So I know in Shropshire, our handling collection, which goes out into schools, is very much the richer, because lots of people have said, oh, would the museum want that? And we're like, well, it's not quite good enough, or we've got an example of that already in the museum, but we could use it to go out into schools to educate them about the Romans, for example. I think that sort of every metal detectorist has a cabinet of finds that they think are their best finds. And so there's a sort of an ownership, a sort of a community curation of these objects as well. And a lot of the finders give the objects to the farmers, especially in this part of the world where farmers are sort of second and third generation farmers, so that their family has a strong link with that place and that landscape. And so sort of there are certain farms in the county with large collections of material which have come up through metal detecting, and that sort of sit in the farmhouse or in the local church or in the village hall, allowing sort of the community around them to understand the history of the place as well. And of course, as in, I've got a wish list of things that I wish people would find, because I'm deeply, deeply interested in them.
oh, tell us the wish list.
So you mentioned I'm a Bronze Age archaeologist, and I've been very lucky recently that there's an amazing site within Shropshire which is producing large amounts of Bronze Age metalwork. It's a wetland site where a community has deliberately placed these amazingly beautiful objects into the sort of the ground as part of some form of ritual, some form of understanding, some form of sort of gift offering to the place and to the gods, or whatever it might be. And this is a repetition that happens right from sort of the beginning of the Bronze Age, so that's around about sort of 4,000-ish years ago, through the Iron Age and into the Roman period. So it's, if you think about sort of churches which have a long history of sort of 1,000 years or so, we've got a religious site, religious landscape with objects which have been placed within it over at least 2,000 years, maybe 3,000 years in some places. So trying to unpick the evidence for that is absolutely fascinating, and sort of lots of these objects are covered by the Treasure Act. So we are, as in the Shropshire Museums, have benefited or will benefit through acquiring those. And likewise, actually, one of the pieces, which is a sun pendant, a gold sun pendant, I'll send you some photos so you can show people on the podcast, which is absolutely fantastic. It's maybe the most beautiful thing I've seen being an archaeologist in 25 years or so. It's unbelievably nice. And that's been acquired by the British Museum for display to anybody who visits there. So there are opportunities for this amazing material to really change the way we think. And this Bronze Age and later prehistoric landscape is almost unique in Western Britain. It has the potential of changing our understanding completely. And we're very lucky that the finders involved in this aren't like the chaps from Leominster. They are there, and yes, they will benefit financially from it, but they're there on the wet days when we've had archaeologists go out and look, and they've helped with the barrows and with the sectioning and with the peak coring. So from that perspective, they're as invested in understanding about the people who live there as anybody else.
I think you've pretty much just covered our last three questions. I was sitting there thinking, where am I going to throw a question in here? And then I kind of thought, do you know what? Unless you
Just
want to
let him talk.
I think we should finish here nicely. I don't know what you think, Alex.
I do. Well, we were going to ask you what interested you the most, but you kind of covered that. But is there anything else is there anything you found as an archaeologist, not been handed as part of the programme, that what's your greatest find?
So I worked as a field archaeologist for 5 years, 6 years or so, working on commercial sites in sort of in urban centres, and also out in the countryside. And I think within my first year of working for the PAS, I'd seen more objects found by just normal people than I had ever discovered. As
what you're saying is your whole life has been wasted on qualifying as an archaeologist.
I just sort of ride the wave of other people's glory, as it were, rather than anything else. I suppose my personal favourite objects are actually ones that I found with my kids.
Yeah.
So we've got a field near to where we live that we've got permission to go field walking on. And my kids are sort of 11 and 13. And over the last 3 or 4 years, we've picked up maybe 20 or 30 worked flints from this field. And through their eyes, I can see the wonder of holding something for the first time since it was lost sort of 6,000 years ago. And actually, it's that discovery, that moment of discovery, that opportunity of physically holding a piece of the past in your hand, which is why I became an archaeologist. As in, it's that sort of that buzz you get from finding. The buzz for me now is through knowing why it's there. But for them, the fact that they can sort of walk with their dad and their mum up and down a field and come and bring me this, what's this? And I'm like, oh, that's a bit of rubbish, or that's a bit of field drain, or that's a bit of pottery, or actually, no, that's really interesting. That's a Bronze Age scrape, or a Neolithic awl, or what have you. So I can see why people get into this finding malarkey. Personally, as in, we have our own little altar, a little collection of found things. But within that, there are also fossils, there are also seashells, there are also shiny pebbles that you pick up on the beach or that you happen to find in the gravel as you're walking home. So their understanding of treasure is very, very different, but actually is as important as anything else. They value sort of the things that are associated with memories and that sort of are about sort of their own journeys. And I think that's as important as any gold neck ring or silver coin. I think it's those things that we need to capture and treasure and remember is that feeling of being the first person to find something or learn something new. And yeah, as in, that's why I do the job that I do now, even if it is at arm's length from physical finding.
Peter, thank you so much. That was so interesting, learning more about the British Museum's Portable Antiquity Scheme. I mean, I didn't know a lot of this, and now maybe I might start coming to the UK and doing some metal detecting, find some stuff, and we can hang out.
Excellent. You're
Absolutely.
more than welcome.
Thank you so much. Join us tomorrow when Kate Owen will be discussing her speciality, which is early modern recipe books. They don't just have recipes in, they're family heirlooms. They get handed down generation after generation, have some really interesting stuff in and some really disgusting recipes as well. So join us to find out all about them. Don't forget that we do exist on Patreon as History Hack and on Patreon as well, which is Podbean's own version. Alina and I have had massive fun doing this in 2020, but life's going to change quite a lot next year and we're going to actually have to go and earn a living, etc. If we want to keep up the regularity that we've been bringing you and the kind of guests that we've been bringing you and the workload, then we will need your help. So if you join, there's going to be incentives for joining on either of those platforms. We're revamping ourselves on both of them. So don't forget to go in. You can do as little as $1 a month and it all goes towards keeping up History Hack as regular as we've been able to bring it to you this year. We are now on YouTube. We are posting all of our new episodes on there and we have our own channel and we are gradually posting all of the back episodes because we have been made aware of the fact that you can only find the last 100 on some platforms. So you can go and listen to your heart's content and laugh at the cartoons and have a great time. So do go over there and subscribe.